Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you're connecting us to. My name is Joshua, the director of El Terreno Cultural Exchange Center here in the Ecuadorian Andes. Great to have you with us today. Today, we have a final presentation from Luke with a brand new internship topic, something fresh out of the box. And I've been really pleased to see Luke's progress over this period, helping develop community agreements and community structures, a legal framework that can be used so that communities can engage in processes specifically around agriculture as a way of generating more income and taking the work that we're doing in this region to the next level. So, Luke, great to have you here. Thanks very much for your time. And I'm going to pass on over to you now.
Perfect. Thank you, Joshua, for the warm welcome. I'm gonna share my screen for my presentation, but I'll give a quick introduction to myself in a second. Okay, can everyone see that? All right, I think
Yes.
so. Perfect. So over the course of the past 6 weeks, I have been working on creating community-centered legal frameworks for a future Chocho's business that the foundation has been interested in helping different communities around the local area start. So to give you a quick introduction to myself, my name is Luke McDermott. I am an intern here at El Terreno, but I'm also a rising senior at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln studying political science, economics, and history. So I have some background in economics and law very generally and hope to go to law school in the future. So that's kind of the skills I was trying to build up in this internship and hopefully apply it into the future. To tell you a bit about El Terreno and its mission, El Terreno is mainly focused on serving the 11 rural and predominantly indigenous communities in the region here. Along with its partners, it does a lot of social and environmental projects. There's water projects going on, projects related to health and safety. Ours is related to business and economic development. Um, the interests that brought me here to El Terreno are economic justice, labor, law, and then also institutional frameworks. So I was looking for an opportunity that allowed me to do hands-on work that was truly impactful for the community and would allow me to kind of utilize those interests in a way that was helpful. To give you some context on the project, I was working on ideating legal frameworks for a chocho business, which is a chocho is a legume that's similar to a soybean in the sense that it has a very high protein content, so it's kind of considered like a superfood. And helping create a business that centers social and popular economy. It trends towards increasing agency for the community, so giving the community more say in how the business is run, and then secures additional funding for El Terreno's social and environmental activities. The core of the project was digesting Ecuadorian economic laws. So there's a few different legal frameworks that exist in Ecuadorian law that govern the sorts of legal entities that eventually we want this enterprise to evolve into. So understanding the principles that exist in those legal frameworks, but also kind of the structural constraints that we would have to deal with in the future. Um, Also analyzing organizational governance documents. So looking at specific associations bylaws, the bylaws for El Toreno itself, looking at different documents that relate to other ventures that have failed in the past, such as a cooperative in the community, conducting interviews with different stakeholders uh, in different communities, specifically Bramadero Chico, which I'll talk about in a bit, and then ideating frameworks for what this business could look like in the future. And I think through this internship, I developed a lot of research skills, some legal writing skills, a lot of relationship building, I think, and then also stakeholder consideration. So there's a lot of different actors that were involved in this project, and trying to balance those considerations is something that I think I grew a lot from. Y un poco español, just un poco. Um, so to tell you a bit about what I'm going to talk to you today about, I'm going to tell you kind of run through what the popular and solidaristic economy is here in Ecuador, talk a bit about the framework setting that we were doing with what this business could look like in the future and what the relationships are going to look like in the short term, some discussion about some considerations that need to be had, and then some future suggestions and remarks. Um, so the popular and solidaristic economy is a economic framework that exists here in Ecuador that prioritizes collective well-being, cooperation, and democratic management over profit. It's very different from the very capitalistic centered economic systems that really permeate a lot of Western countries. Um, and it focuses on organizing economic activity around solidarity, reciprocity, human dignity, community, these sorts of values, which really focus on bettering the environment around you, understanding that your own well-being is connected to the well-being of the community, which is very different than the kind of private economy which exists to further sole ownership, competition, profit maximization, those sorts of values. These are the eight different entities that exist within the popular and social economy here in Ecuador. I'm going to run through all of them, and in this presentation, there's going to be a lot of description of what these actors do, but I'm really only going to harp on the ones that are super important to the specific Chocho business project that I was working on. Some of them are really used in other contexts more, mainly, but I'll cover them and talk a bit about what their purpose are. First is community sector organizations. So, community sector organizations, you can think of these, some examples of them, indigenous community enterprises, women's collectives. A lot of these are formed around the basis of territorial, cultural, familial, ecological ties. They do economic activities, but they really are formed around, people groups, nationalities, and mainly they only are consisted of natural persons. The second are associative sector organizations. This is one that we were going to be spending a lot of time with this project. They only consist of natural persons, and they're concerned with producing, marketing, consuming lawfully and socially necessary goods and services. So you can think of these like agricultural enterprises, collectives for fishing, artisan supply associations. Um, they are formed by natural persons and they all come together to perform economic activities. And those economic activities can be they can be for like the community itself, but oftentimes they also have external exchanges in private markets or between other entities within the social and solidaristic economy. And this is one of the main types of organizations that El Torino would be working with. The third is a cooperative sector organization. So a cooperative sector organization, I think in the West, like the word cooperative is used a lot, and I think that that's kind of like a good analogous way to think about it. It's a jointly owned company that's democratically managed by all of its members. So it operates a lot like an economy in the sense that it is doing economic activities that are meant to be uh, have private market exchanges with the goods that are produced. Um, I think they can operate like associations, but I think one of the main differences that differentiate it from an association are one, it can consist of natural and legal members. So when I say natural members, I mean a person like you or I, and a legal member is an entity such as like a corporation or a foundation. They can be members. It also has a very complicated structure. Not more complicated than than necessarily like a corporation would, but association can really form what it looks like. It has a lot more freedom in the way it forms its bylaws, whereas cooperative sector organizations have a lot of requirements relating to what a general assembly can look like, who can be on the board of directors, what sorts of entities have to be hired to allow for transparency and accountability, those sorts of things. Another one is a popular economic unit. So a popular economic unit is, you can really think of it as a small business. An individual family or domestic unit is going to be doing some type of economic activity like, textiles, sewing, barbers, daycare, these sorts of things, which are really performed by individuals or families. But the purpose of a popular economic unit is to allow them to access the kind of benefits that the Ecuadorian government provides to entities within the popular and solidaristic economy. So, um, accessing microloans, access to training, priority in a lot of different agencies that provide assistance to businesses. Um, Entities within this social and solidaristic economy get preferential access, and that's why you might be incentivized to start a popular economic unit. Popular and solidaristic financial sector entities, really, this is like community banks, credit unions, that sort of thing. Really wouldn't be working a lot with these, but they these take the form of cooperatives or associations, but they hold extra requirements because they operate within the financial sector. There's a lot of different requirements for how they must operate. There's also mixed organizations. So mixed organizations occur when the state and a private entity decide to come together in a joint venture. Really, the benefit of this is that you get access to public funds for projects which the government believes is beneficial for the community as a whole. Now, these are short-term ventures in the sense that there's always a plan to evolve the entity into either an association or a cooperative or any other type of more permanent entity within the popular and solidaristic economy. So this is really a transition entity while a large scale project is being performed. And then there's integration bodies. Integration bodies are, they can either be representative or economic in nature. So a representative integration body is something you can think of as like a union or a, uh, an indigenous confederation that represents multiple indigenous communities and advocates on their behalf. An economic integration body is one which provides assistance and to other entities within the popular and solidaristic economy for doing economic activities. So you can think of it as an entity that might have a bunch of associations in it, and then it does the marketing work for it, or it does the distribution and exportation for it. Um, or you might think of it as like a network of different producers. I think one of the main distinctions of this between a cooperative is that it has a lot more flexibility in the way that you form its bylaws than the way that you form its founding documents. And then also it has this weighted voting system where, since it is made up of legal persons, and those legal persons oftentimes have natural members as their membership. There's a weighted voting system where if one entity has a lot more members to it, it can have up to 5 times more of a vote than another, but it still kind of protects that minority rule in the sense that it's only up to 5 times more of a vote. And this is all specified in the economic and solidaristic economy law. And then there's also support entities. So support entities are actually not within the social and solidaristic economy, but they can access a lot of the same benefits that entities in the social and solidaristic economy do. But the caveat is, so you could think of it as a corporation or foundation. The caveat is that its sole purpose needs to be providing support to an entity within the social and solidaristic economy. So you could think of a foundation whose sole purpose is to help associations who produce agricultural products do it sustainably. If that was one of the sole or main purposes of that corporation, then it could be a support entity and access some of these benefits like public funds and that sort of thing. To talk about some of the principles that exist within the social and solidaristic economy, first is solidarity. So this is prioritizing the common good over personal profit. It emphasizes practicing ethical interdependence. So this is the idea which I talked about before, that the good of oneself is tied to the good of others. So if you're in an association, you understand that the good of your own self and of your family is tied to the good of your community, of your association. And it really expresses reinvesting profits into communities, practicing flexibility when there's hardship faced by members within your entity of the social and solidaristic economy. There's also reciprocity. One of the key tenets of this is employing non-exploitative practices um, to enhance relationships, whereas in in the capitalistic sense, you would think that, all manner of practices are really fair game, in that you really your sole purpose is to maximize profit, whereas really in the social and solidaristic economy, you want to enhance relationships, which de-incentivizes non-exploitative practices. It also values non-monetary contributions like time, knowledge, care, labor. And this can be expressed as helping those who have helped you in the past and circular giving. Also cooperation, so working together towards shared goals. A lot of these economic and solidaristic social units also have horizontal structures with egalitarian participation, so democratic governance principles, really not a lot of like sole ownership. That doesn't really exist in the social and solidaristic economy. And this really is expressed by consensus-driven decision making, rotating leadership roles, these sorts of practices which allow for the whole community and whole entity to work together. To talk a bit about the framework, so we spent a lot of time trying to ideate what will this entity look like in the future, because that's going to guide how we want to start forming the entity now. So um, to talk about the initial actors, the first two actors that we have to think about are the coordination entity. This is the entity that exists to assist in production, quality control, export, marketing, the sorts of activities which farmers don't necessarily have the expertise to engage in, and that's what really this business venture exists to help in, is what are the sorts of technical aspects which farmers don't have as much of experience in. And then the association. So I name Association Brahmadero Chico because that is an association which before me was identified as being one of the most promising in being the first raw material producer. Really, this relationship and this framework applies to any association, but I do think that at this point, this is probably still the association which El Terreno would be moving forward with. But do keep in mind that it could be generalized to any association. To tell you a bit about Brahmadero Chico, Brahmadero Chico is a community close to Azantahua, and it's split between two different associations. And the split really it reflects a lot of the social, geographic, and possibly ethnic divisions which exist within the community. So, Brahmadero Chico, the upper, which is not the initial one we were working with, but it's a larger one which exists in the higher part of the community. It's mostly indigenous. There's about 50 members. It's the older association, and even though it's kind of gone dormant a little bit, a lot of the members are were very eager to restart activity. And the meetings for this association are very dependent on the active project. So at the last meeting, they'll decide, do we need to have another meeting anytime soon? It's not really on a regular schedule. Association Brahmadero Chico in the lower part of the community is mostly mestizo. There's around 15 members. 15 members legally, but it sounds like some of them are leaving, and some of them are inactive as well. It was recently considered the stronger association because it was receiving better contracts. But recently, a lot of the members are leaving. They hold regular meetings, but they're unable to reach quorum. So we found this out when we attempted to go to one of their meetings, and they told us it was rescheduled, or it wasn't going to happen because of a celebration. But later we found out that the meeting was held at 5 p.m., but they were unable to reach quorum because not enough people showed up. Um, but it was really helpful to talk to people in the upper community as well, because we found out that neither of these associations are really conducting most of their business within the regular meeting schedule. They're actually conducting their business at community meetings. So that's really a great future direction for if we want to have these conversations with the associations. Maybe the best place to socialize this agreement is actually in the community meetings and not in the association meetings themselves. This initial relationship is going to be, in my eyes, between the foundation El Terreno will be the coordination entity itself. So the labor for the marketing, the export, the quality control is going to exist within the El Terreno, the entity, because that's really where a lot of the labor is going to be coming from. It's going to be coming from Joshua to an extent, to interns, individuals which the foundation employs, which will be helping the associations through a private contractual relationship. So the nature of this initial relationship, like I said, is going to be a private contractual relationship which exists with outside of the social and solidaristic economy. But I think it's important to form this relationship like this early on so that we don't add too much bureaucracy. We don't create structures which actually might hinder the operations um, of this enterprise before it's really had the chance to even get off the ground. And this will give the opportunity for the foundation to mature its business operations. So understand what it actually means to partner with um, a company like Loopwe or partner with multiple associations and provide useful services to them, coordinate trainings, make sure that they have the right product certifications. These are all things that are going to take time to understand and for the business to mature. So I think it's best that it does start as a private contractual relationship. During this time, it is my belief that most of or all of the surpluses from the Chocho business operation should be reinvested into the operations, where, while this is a pilot project and while both parties are really learning their role, there the enterprise really should be being reinvested in. If any capital equipment needs to be bought, I think this is kind of where that should go towards. And then a lot of the human labor for the coordination efforts at this time will be coming from El Terreno. It's interns, it's associates, like I said. To talk a bit about the framework agreement, so in I was tasked with creating a agreement between any given association and the foundation to generally outline what the rights, obligations, and prohibitions are for this relationship. So this is a very generic agreement between the two entities, and this really required me to take a mindset shift because one thing I was noticing as I was going through a lot of the Ecuadorian law and also the private governance documents which exist in Ecuador is that there's a certain lack of specificity that I know does exist in a lot of U.S. law, and that's because they like to start out with a very general agreement, which then precipitates further covenants, agreements, contracts, which specify on the articles which exist within the framework agreement. So this is very general and it outlines the purpose of the agreement, the scope, so what sorts of activities are fall within the scope of the agreement, the decision-making mechanism. So how do we resolve controversies? How do we decide future agreements? How do we actually execute this framework agreement? And then outlines also the obligations for each party and jointly, the rights of each party and jointly, and the prohibitions for each party and jointly. And this is a private contractual agreement. And this was a interesting undertaking because it required that I balance practicality. So there's a point of how do we actually make sure this business works? And it's, you know, it, we don't just center virtue, but also we are very practically minded about thinking about how to best operationalize this business. Secondly, community agency. So one of the big design principles for this institution in my mind is ensuring that the community has a say in the operations, but also increasingly over time, they start to amass more agency and independence as they become more capable to do so. And then also institutional intent. So El Terreno has an interest in making sure that this business not only flourishes, but also stays connected with the foundation so that they can realize some of the profits to go towards their social projects, which I was talking about earlier, such as the water project, which is helping a lot of communities. Eventually, I do see an evolution in this relationship. So the coordination entity, I believe, at some point should be divorced from the foundation, as you can see in this framework. And I think that this really should occur once the entity is working with more than three or so associations. And I think that this is an important number because uh, at this point, you're only operating within private contractual relationships. And you will need, if you want to form a entity that exists within the social and solidaristic economy, you'll need to convince all of these associations to actually join with that coordination entity and agree to its democratic principles, that sort of thing. And that becomes a much more audacious task once we get to a point where there's more than 4 or 5 associations that we're working with. It becomes a much more politically infeasible task. So I think that divorce, even though the maturity might not be quite there, should occur um, once you kind of get to this critical mass of 3 or 4 associations. And I do think there's still a strong relationship between the foundation and the community and the coordination entity at this point, and that relationship would have to be defined within the bylaws of the coordination entity, but also in further private contractual relationships between the foundation as a private entity and the coordination entity as a entity that exists within the social and solidaristic economy. Some considerations for why I think an evolution is important is first maturity. So there will come a time in which the business is matured to a point and there's multiple associations within that are coordinating with it that if the business operations are matured, we should be willing to give a little bit more independence and agency to the associations to help within the decision-making processes, give them a little bit more power in the process. Um, Also, the previous relationship, which I described, that private contractual relationship, exists within the private market and doesn't, even though you can bake in some of the principles of social and solidaristic economy, it doesn't necessarily assure that. And transitioning to this framework is an utmost goal for aligning with some of the business practices which have um, been outlined in the Ley Organica, the social and solidaristic economy. And then also we want to avoid reliance. So we want to avoid the situation where these associations are fully reliant on El Terreno as an institution. Give them a little bit more democratic control over their operations so that in the future they have a lot more self-determination to ensure that this business doesn't just collapse and it's not fully dependent on El Terreno as an entity, continuing to provide training and technical assistance and that sort of thing. Some different alternatives for what the coordination entity could be. First, it could be a cooperative. So cooperative is very membership driven. They have an equal voting process, but it has a highly formalized internal governance process. So they have supervisors, they have a board of directors, they have assemblies, and there's very specific regulations about how you form these to create accountability and transparency. So very formalized, but an equal voting process. And then there's an economic integration body. An economic integration body can be seen as an organization of organizations with proportional voting. So it would be an organization which is formed by multiple associations, which we are partnering with, and they would have proportional voting based on the membership that they have. So if we went back to the example of the Bromadero Chico example, if both of those associations were partnering with us, and one has 15 members and one has 50 members, it's likely that there would be kind of a split of like a 1 to 3, 1 to 4 vote-ish split between the two. For support entities, so support entities actually exist with outside of the social and solidaristic economy, as I was mentioning before, but they're allowed to access a lot of the benefits that exist for the social and solidaristic economy. So if you think of a private foundation that's created solely for benefiting and assisting in the marketing, export, distribution of these chochos, that would be a support entity, but it's governed by civil code, municipal governance rules, foundation laws, such as how El Terreno Foundation is currently governed. Um, I kind of outline here the differences between the governance models for the cooperative economic integration bodies and support entities. I kind of outlined what the main differences are. It's that voting system, the proportional versus one vote. In the support entity, it's really determined by its private statutes. So the support entity who it's formed by, which would be out there in a foundation, can solely decide what its governance principles are. Um, One of the main distinctions for membership is that a cooperative can be formed by natural persons and legal entities, or only legal entities as well. That would be a second order institution, in which case each one of them only has one vote. Whereas an economic integration body is fully formed by only legal persons, other organizations, cooperatives, associations, that sort of thing. And there's a proportional voting system. In terms of the executive bodies, there's a board of directors elected by the assembly in a cooperative. In an economic integration body, you really get to decide what your governance bodies look like. There's a lot more flexibility. And then in a support entity, again, it's defined fully by private law. However, you want to structure your governance bodies is dependent on how it's formed. So if this support entity is owned by El Terreno Foundation can solely decide what the governance decisions are in that entity. Some considerations are profit sharing for El Terreno. So one of the main purposes for undergoing this project is creating profits that will then go towards the social projects which El Terreno Foundation engages in. So, in a cooperative and economic integration body, provisions concerning profit sharing are written into the bylaws, which allows a little more agency for these associations. So, if the associations wholly wanted to change how profit sharing works, they would be able to do that. Within a support agent entity, it directly controls profit sharing for social projects. So there's a little less agency there in the sense that whoever has governance control over the support entity, which I would imagine would probably be El Torino Foundation or members of El Torino Foundation, they can really write what the profit sharing looks like, and how you go about doing that. Another consideration is the possibility of a severed relationship, and this can really run both ways when you kind of put yourself in different mindsets. So, in a cooperative or economic integration body, there's the possibility that they could sever the relationship with El Terreno through governance mechanisms, amending bylaws. But with a support entity, they can't really easily sever the relationship with El Terreno without separating from the coordination entity itself. And you can really look at that both ways in the sense that like they're more structurally tied in with a support entity, but that also require them to kind of shut down their operations if they were to decide to sever their relationship. Like I said, until high maturity, there's gonna be a lot of overlap between the operations elsewhere in a foundation and the coordination entity. And then I think when you're looking at agency, there's a lot of ways to structure technical decisions versus governance decisions within bylaws. So I would see it more as a matter of agency in governance rather than agency in the technical decisions that are being made. I think technical decisions are still going to fall towards a lot of the expertise which exists at El Terreno Foundation, especially as that expertise is not held by the agricultural workers in the short term. A bit of discussion. So I think there's a couple different relationships that we have to consider for the future. This first one is the instance in which there's an individual farmer which would like to work with an association. So we have baked into the framework agreement that an association is not allowed to be an intermediary. So they can't purchase agricultural product. We talk about like the final agricultural products such as the chocha bean from individual farmers unless there's express permission to do so. And I think that's we have to consider though that there are going to be instances in which you need to beef up production, and it might be necessary to integrate individual farmers which associations have relationships with. But the problem is that the foundation itself, or the coordination entity specifically, cannot enforce its own private contractual relationship with the association onto an individual farmer which is not a part of that association. So even though we could specify to the association, you need to have these sort of control mechanisms for your individual farmers. I believe it's important for the coordination entity to have a private contractual relationship with the individual farmer, as well as regulations on the association for how they interact with individual farmers. I think that dual relationship is going to be important. So there needs to be a secondary agreement with individual farmers if we want to integrate them into this ecosystem. Another commentary for future discussion to kind of think about is the social provisioning portion of this. So once divorce happens between the coordination entity and the foundation, it might be beneficial for both entities to then think about a third order social provisioning entity, which decides the profit sharing mechanism. So that kind of takes it out of the hands, the political um, machinations of the coordination entity and the foundation, that if it's just a private contractual relationship, it might be weaker and that could be severed. So um, creating an entity which is whose sole purpose is to decide the social provisioning. So how much of the profits go back towards the associations, goes towards operations for the coordination entity, and then how much of it goes towards the social projects for the foundation. That might be a beneficial mechanism, and this is kind of a very long-term outlook, maybe 15, 20 years, when operations are fully matured, to think about what sorts of entities could do that. And I think this third order social provisioning entity could also be seen as an umbrella for other operations that the foundation supports. So if there was another economic activity which the foundation supported, it could also fall under this third order social provisioning entity, which could kind of act as an umbrella for all the operations which the foundation supports. Some future suggestions and remarks. So next steps are finalizing the framework agreement, which I will be working on later today, but also I am sure it will need some iterations as you learn more about the nature of the business. Um, Socializing the framework agreement with the community, so going to the community meeting and talking to both associations. We know there's this tension between the two communities, so it's important to speak to both of them. At the same time, I believe, and without favorable terms to either, to form an agreement with Lupwi, to outline the specifics of the relationship between the coordination entity, which at this time is probably going to be the foundation, and Lupwi, to talk about training, to talk about seed distribution, that sort of thing. Sign an agreement with the two associations of Romadeo Chico, and then begin operations. Regarding Ramadero Chico, two suggestions I would have is an agreement must be negotiated with the community as a forum. So instead of going to each individual association, I think the community itself needs to be the forum for that. And then I think the agreements with the upper and lower associations must mirror one another to avoid conflict. It is my understanding from talking to the members of the community that um, if one association were to receive favorable terms over the other, that would cause a lot of conflict, not only with the coordination entity, but between the two associations, which would cause long-term problems. Second, regarding the agreement, um, any agreement, as I've had these conversations with members of the community, must have some level of assurance for training. They know they need the training, so that being assured in the contract would be very beneficial. Price guarantees, maybe not a specific price, but sort of mechanisms that say if sale is made above market price, you will be paid at least market price. Those sorts of assurances to me, so that they know they're going to get a favorable price for their product. And then purchase guarantee. So actually saying that we will purchase product from you. I know that was a worry that was communicated, that there might not be an assurance that the foundation would actually purchase as much product as they produce. Um, and it also is my understanding that the lower association may desire greater specificity in the initial agreement. So, whereas the upper association seemed content with kind of a general framework agreement, the lower association seemed to want something that was a little more concrete. Regarding future directions, I would suggest that we collect the bylaws of the upper association so that we can understand their democratic governance practices. We already have the lower associations, which have been transcribed and translated. Um, Also, an individual with Chocho production expertise is likely going to be needed to further elaborate on the framework agreement. So, I think someone with technical expertise in that area could read through and notice certain practices that are not specified and may need to be specified in the framework agreement. Also, an individual with business knowledge is likely going to be needed to further elaborate on things like production schedules, payment guarantees, volume guarantees, these kind of technical things, which I don't have expertise in. Um, that was a lot of information, but I'd love to hear any questions from anyone about the project or any future directions.
Thank you, Luke. Much appreciate you taking the time. to share this work that you've done. A lot of initiative has gone into this. Um, and so, yeah, I guess I've got a few questions around that.
Perfect.
Let me just pull them up. So, first of all, a couple of things for a couple of clarification questions. Um, for those who don't know, what does mestizo mean?
Mestizo is someone who uh, has their ethnic background is one which is both indigenous and has European ancestry as well.
Right. And in terms of Ecuadorian law, some people might be hearing, well, you're talking about business, but you're also talking about a charity. What
Mhm.
does that mean in Ecuadorian law, and how does that maybe differ from laws in other countries such as the United States?
Yeah, so there is very different from the United States in the sense that almost everything in the United States exists within this sphere of the private economy. Obviously, there's like nonprofit entities and there's certain protections for those, but there's a whole different sector in Ecuador in that there's a area of business and an area of enterprise that's fully focused on centering community and centering um, you know bettering the environment, bettering um, the social fabric of that community, which and there's structural protections for that sort of entity, which don't really exist in the United States. So I think that's kind of like a framework shift you have to think of is that in Ecuador, there's the private economy, there's the social economy, which involves which does interact with private entities, and then there's also like this area of the private economy, which is also the nonprofit entities, which is kind of like El Terreno Foundation, where um, I think a nonprofit entity in Ecuador, like the foundation, is probably very analogous to one in the United States. But the real distinction, which is hard for people to maybe grasp, is the social market part of it.
Great, thank you. And what's been what's been a surprise for you? So,
Hmm.
coming into this, you obviously have in 6 short weeks, you've had to learn about Ecuadorian, not only the laws, but also the culture and the realities of being here. So, what were some of the
Mhm.
biggest surprises that you've come across?
I think one of the biggest surprises I've come across is just how informal a lot of um, interactions are, and also how much you need to learn about like the de facto reality than just what exists in writing or in law. Um, I assume that like there's a lot of work that I could do just, reading the association's bylaws and like reading how they work. But when you actually kind of go into the community, you realize there's a lot of personal politics and there's a lot of um, misfunctionings that really impact how that operates. So um, there's a lot of considerations that I had to make about like how things exist in reality that I didn't think I would have to contend with, but
Hmm.
it's been an interesting process to have to like navigate that.
Nice, nice, great. If anybody else has got a question, feel free to raise your hand. It'd be great to hear from you. Okay. So, one of the other things that you did is you went to go and visit Salinas de Guaranda, um,
Mhm.
which was one of the reasons that I came to this region, a really interesting model of sustainable development. So I'd be interested to hear, maybe you can give people a little bit of introduction
Mhm.
of what Salinas is and how that also informed the work that you were doing.
Yeah. Salinas, and correct me if I'm getting this historical background wrong, but um, it was the center of the old hacienda that existed in this region that it consisted of about three different provinces. And it was also the start of the indigenous uprising that broke down that hacienda. Um, and it's kind of unique in the sense that it's become a home for one of the largest social and solidaristic entities in the region that does a lot of different economic activities. They have, dairy, they make yogurts, cheeses, chocolates that get exported all across Ecuador. but it's a very complex network of both like um, private entity, like nonprofit foundation entities, but also these like cooperatives and associations. Um, and it's a very like complex network. And I think that I went there and I saw that they do. I think it does benefit the community a lot because you can tell that there's like a lot of pride in the products and there's also um, a lot of economic development because of it. So I think it's a good model for thinking about what we could do in Atandahua. Um, yeah, I think it's hard to fully grasp though, like how much bureaucracy has existed in Salinas though, and I think that was one thing I was noticing when I was there was um, even though I think it's a great model for economic development, maybe the way that it's been s- this kind of like colossal structure might not be the best ideal for moving forward here, in my opinion.
And is that where you're, as you were saying in your presentation, where the potential divorcing and separation from entities so that they can work more independent, is that where that inspiration came from?
Partially, yes. I think like I I want to think about the long term in the sense that people change in a foundation. Eventually, you'll move on from this position, and all new people will occupy this entity. And an entity only exists as like the people that make it up. So you don't know how that's going to exist. So you want to create structural safeguards that exist to protect the community. So if it ever needed to divorce from an entity, it has the autonomy to do so. And I think that was something that was at least reinforced for me in Salinas in the sense that there's so much bureaucracy and so much ownership of capital goods by this foundation that it would seem very hard for me to imagine a cooperative or an association splitting off from this like colossal entity that exists, Salinas, because it's a Goliath of marketing and ownership of these capital equipment. So I think that reinforced for me at least that there should be a lot more decentralized control for these entities.
Great. Thank you. We have your mentor, Sebastian, on the call. He's put a question in the chat saying, what studies would be required to continue and implement a successful Chocho project?
Hmm. I think two things which I think are very important. I think we're going to need people with that expertise is first, and I think Loopy could be a very important partner in this is understanding the specific chocho production process and making sure that those specifics are reflected in the framework agreement. So I'm not immune to knowing that I'm sure there's things that I've left unaddressed just because I don't know exactly how the agricultural process itself works. And I think that getting someone with that expertise to read it over and think, this doesn't address an issue which I see coming up would be very important. And then also someone with business expertise to come in and really review, um, production schedules, how pricing is going to work, and how we ensure that a fair price actually is delivered. Um, I think these sorts of considerations are important, but they're ones that I don't necessarily know how to address because there's a level of practicality that I don't know how to permeate. I don't know how to do pricing, so I think someone with that business expertise who can then make commentary on the framework agreement would be really important. And then I think Sebastian really emphasized the importance of the socialization of the agreement to the community. So I think that was something I was a little naive to at first was, um, you know, this doesn't work just if we can get, the main stakeholders, the presidents or the legal representatives of these organizations to sign on. We also need the entire community to believe in the project and to be excited about it and to participate in it because people can just drop out of these organizations and then, the project doesn't sustain itself. So socializing that agreement to the community and getting people excited about it in a very strategic, I use the term lobbying, but a very strategic way to get the community excited about it, I think is really important.
Okay, so we're nearly out of time. Oh, hope
Oh,
I've just seen you open your mic. Have you got a question?
yes. I just wanted to ask Luke, with all his experience and all of the research he has done, like from your perspective, why do you think like the social enterprise model really works in Ecuador? And I know there may be like a political background to everything, but like why is it that people are so motivated to work together? Like you don't see this in very many like countries, people coming together, but like I don't know what would be the reason why this type of models work so well here.
Um, I will say I don't think it necessarily work like in the sense that like it functions as a business, it works or doesn't work more than a private enterprise. I think a private enterprise can necessarily work just as much as a social enterprise, but I think that it keeps people motivated more and because they feel like they have a sense of community and they feel like they have a sense of democratic control over the operations. I think if we all felt like we were like a stakeholder or um, a part owner in the operations that we conducted in our lives, I think, we would automatically be more invested. I think there's also with a lot of these organizations, a geographic and community component, which private enterprises usually don't have. I think like if I were to go work for a business, I likely am not living in community at all with any of the other people I'm working with. I don't necessarily feel like I have a sense of responsibility for the well-being of the other people in my private enterprise, whereas in these social enterprises, they often are geographically constrained, and I would feel like a sense of responsibility for the well-being of my neighbor or someone that I've been growing up next to for 20 years. So I think those sorts of community ties are really what make these social enterprises strong. Um, and I think the structural protections are what make them favorable to a private enterprise.
Great, thank you. So we're almost out of time. If there's anyone else who'd like to ask one more question, the space is yours. In the meantime, I'd like to say, Luke, thank you very much for your hard work. You brought a real thoroughness to the work that you've done, as well as being able to adapt to yourself to a local community, a local climate, and despite the limitations around the language barrier, I think you've taken this project that really is still in its early stages, but you've made an important piece of work and left something that will be a really important legacy to be able to go forwards, so that it doesn't turn out like so many other projects here in Ecuador, which are very slapdash. They're not very well thought through. They start something off, but they don't have the ability to continue with the legacy in the long term because they're not well structured. So thank you for that. Congratulations, and I hope this has also been a step for you to broaden your horizons and to be able to build your skills going forward in your career. So I don't know if you've got any final words you'd like to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Joshua, for always being a wonderful supervisor here at the project. I think like this it took me a lot of like framework shifting and like adaptation to really understand how to be useful to this project, but I've really grown to enjoy it and I feel like I've learned so much about how economies can be structured and different ways of thinking about economic development. So I've really enjoyed everything I've taken from here and also really enjoyed Kiliko and the communal living. So thank you so much for your mentorship, and thank you, Sebastian, as well, for always challenging me, um, challenging my mindset, challenging my Western chip, as you say, um, and helping me to think differently and think harder.
Great, congratulations. Um, so if anyone else is listening, interested in taking this project forward or any of our other internships, you can visit our website at www.elterrenoecuador.com. Until next time, thank you, Luke. Congratulations, a massive round of applause, and all the best going forwards.